New Babylon, One World Government Rising. Part 1. This Part 1 will be a commentary, which will be followed by Part 2, which will be a Bible study, a biblical reference study. One world government is coming. It is prophesied to happen in the Bible, but global government is an agenda which has been in the works for quite some time, far longer than most suspect. Most would never have thought that the United States would ever give up its position as the world's superpower to join a world union or to join into a one world government, but it shall. It is already underway. The United States has been on this course for a very long time. We hear it now all the time. The global family, the New World Order. In Europe, they have already achieved this partially. They have a conglomeration of European states, which now have one currency, the euro, which is money that can be spent anywhere in Europe despite the number of languages in different countries. Several years ago, some in power came up with the idea to make the United States, Canada, and Mexico a union with no borders. And through various trade agreements, they have done just this. It's not official yet, but it is in the works. They are speaking now of having one currency for America, Canada, and Mexico as well, the Amero. Even though the majority of Americans want a secure border, the politicians and powers that be in government go against the will of the people time and time again and do nothing or make half-hearted gestures such as a border fence that's 700 miles long and 12 feet high, which is useless and makes no sense. And now we know why. It goes against the globalization agenda. 2 police officers, 2 border agents were arrested and sent to jail for doing their job, arresting a Mexican drug smuggler trying to sneak into America. That made no sense, but they were made an example out of, and even though they were pardoned, they spent a year of their lives in jail for doing what they were hired to do. Again, we know from the Bible that the world will be put under a global government system. It is written in the books of Daniel and in Revelation and other places. But this one world agenda has been being carried out behind the scenes since before America was even a nation. Now some may find that hard to believe, but nevertheless it is true. Until a few years ago, it was unthinkable that America would ever give up her sovereignty and enter into a world family, a world government. But as time has passed and attitudes have changed and prophecy has been fulfilled, we can now see this happening, and we can see it daily. And this agenda has not so much to do with the two-party system which is in power in the United States as much as it has to do with who controls the parties. The parties which are more a distraction than anything else, even though the Leftwing is vastly more intertwined in this global government scheme. When I say left, I mean the progressive movement of late. I mean those who control the media, television, newspapers, radio, magazines, and other outlets of information, internet blogs and so forth, which pump out propaganda at an alarming rate. Over the last 60 years or so, the leftist movement has gained a lot of power with a lot of speed in the United States. And they have entrenched themselves in key positions and key places of power. They have exploited every tool of fleshly weakness to gain their power, from pandering to perversion to bribery, outright misinformation and disinformation, scandal, lies, innuendo. And they know how to cause division so that they can run in like a spurious cavalry and claim to fix the problem peacefully. In other words, government will take care of you. Vote for bigger government. The movement which currently labels themselves as liberal is anything but liberal. They are not the liberals of old. They're a different breed altogether. The liberals of old were very much against communism or anything that even smacked of it. They were a people of faith. They were true liberals. But now all of those true liberals have been supplanted by a newer, more extreme so-called progressive left wing, which over the past 5 to 6 decades has slowly grafted themselves into the left wing. The left wing party that was, that is. And now they have taken over completely. Yet this new left wing are only misguided puppets under the real power behind the scenes. The real power controls not only them, but many in the right as well. The real power is not in the left or right, but in those who remain hidden, who fund them, who bribe them, who control them through various means, and who control the world's commerce, or at least much of it. You can call them whatever you like, the Bilderbergers, the Illuminati, but they are a generation who are named in the Bible as the offspring of vipers, the children of Hamath, the synagogue of Satan, from the books of Revelation chapter 2 and 3. They are a slow and methodic masters of deception and perception. They do not do anything fast, and they leave nothing undone. They are builders of cities. They are makers and breakers of kings and nations. And they have held a lot of influence over the affairs of man and of the world. But it is only recently that their power has surged and come to the level of control that they currently hold. They are the progeny of Cain. The seed of Satan is referred to by Christ in the parable of the tares and the wheat. They have gone by many labels over the millennia. They are called the Kenites, the Nethinim, and the Kenites, of course, meaning in Hebrew the sons of Cain. They are responsible for most of the bloodshed in the world, from the murder of righteous Abel by their progenitor Cain, to the persecution of the prophets, and even the death of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ and his apostles, and many Christians down through the ages. Now some will think I am speaking of the Jews. I am not. For Cain's children are not Jews, nor do they have anything to do with the tribe of Judah, save that they have grafted themselves into the tribe of Judah. This is the method of Cain's children, to graft themselves in, to become a part unknowingly, to creep in unawares. This people, the children of Cain, are a people of fleshly means, a people of commerce and money, a people who deny truth and stand against right by cunning argument. They never come out and say what it is they stand for. No, quite the contrary. Instead, they cloak themselves in seemingly righteous arguments, acts, and noble pursuits. They use seemingly good works and initiatives to bring about their power. Anyone who is awake and attuned to their methods can spot them. But sadly, most are not even aware of their existence. They are involved in things that no one would suspect, like the Federal Reserve of the United States, which is a privately owned bank and not government-owned as most assume because it has the name federal in it. And again, they are involved in noble and peaceful pursuits, world earth-friendly movements, charitable-seeming programs, and this is their power, and this is how they grow. This is their deception. They have financed revolutions and wars. They have moved at key times down through history to bring about many of the world's events. But even so, they have remained hidden and unexposed in the shadows. They were the power that financed the Napoleonic Wars, and later brought down Russia from being a monarchy with a rich Christian heritage to being a socialistic, communistic, religionless nation of oppression under fascism. They played a key role in starting and financing World War I, and seized upon the opportunity of the tragedy of that war to start one of their biggest jumps towards world government, which is to say, the formation of the League of Nations, and the formation of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is a tool that they have used to manipulate the nations of the world through diplomacy and trickery. again, peaceably. They financed the rise to power of a young ex-World War I officer named Adolf Hitler in Germany, and by use of their skills in deception and propaganda brought him to power and set him upon a course to conquer and subdue Europe into a unified state under Nazi control, which is to say, socialistic rule. Socialism and communism are tools to them. Now, when that plan failed, they once again seized upon the tragedy of World War II and the horrors that it brought about, and used their influence over the leaders of the world and formed the United Nations and NATO. And they used these to take even bigger steps towards world control, world government. Now, these sons of Cain have always stood together and worked behind the scenes. They have raised politicians to power. They have funded campaigns and movements. They have manipulated people through unions, through strong-arming, through extortion. And they always play both sides of the field. They are not ignorant. They play both sides of the field to the ignorance of those who they empower, but they are not ignorant. They are cunning and steadfast. In America, they have entrenched themselves in all facets of things. In the post-World War II, late 40s, was the turning point for them. This is when things began to change in America, the birth of the age of the progressives. As World War II ended, many of the American troops came home, that is to say, those who didn't stay in occupation armies in the reconstruction of Europe and Japan. But as these young men came home, who were still in their early 20s and late teens, many of them married and set up families in this new age of prosperity in America. America had, during World War II, vastly industrialized and become the superpower of the world. And now Russia was catching up and was only a few steps behind. Nevertheless, in America, jobs were plentiful, the economy was strong, and the baby boomer generation was being conceived, and being born en masse. However, again, their parents were young and inexperienced in parenting, and fed on the tragedies of war. And so many of the baby boomer kids grew up with too much prosperity, too much freedom, and not enough discipline. And as they began to grow and reach their teens and 20s and the 60s, many of them were lost as to what to do with their lives. They were drunken with the freedoms and liberties they had been given. So many of them did what teens seeking an identity do when they have no set course. They rebelled. They began the counterculture movement. They turned against the normal. They grew their hair long. They smoked pot. They dressed funny. They experimented with heavier and heavy drugs. And they loathed authority. Not to mention, many of them were indoctrinated as they attended college, where the New Age so-called humanist movement was growing and indoctrinating youth and spinning them into radical idealism. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll was the popular attitude, and the humanist New Age movement seized upon this. And they cultivated the idea of no responsibility, no work, just peace and love for all your fellow human beings. And this was how they manipulated. If you tell a teenager that he doesn't have to do anything but just enjoy himself, what do you think he's going to do? Again, this attitude was cultivated by the humanists, the New Age movement, the New Consciousness movement. They were self-labeled as the enlightened free-thinking movement. And from their positions as teachers, professors, and in entertainment, they seized upon the vulnerability and fleshly nature of youth and indoctrinated them to rebel against the standards, the morals, and even the religions of their fathers. So the left-wing movement came into power and thrived, and has continued to do so even to this current time. But now all of those countercultural baby boomers and radicals are middle and retirement aged. They are now lawyers, politicians, some of them wealthy and powerful, some of them the heads of big business. And others are involved with passing on their New Age secularist philosophy. They gave birth to things like the Go Green movement, which they have an agenda behind. This movement always has a need to cause revolution and to overturn the status quo. They, in turn, are bringing up youth under their guidelines, under their creed. Just as they were misled when they were young, when they were looking for a cause. And what has creeped into them is, at times, even evil, demonic. We're going to talk a little bit about that, the Luciferian aspect of this New Age movement. Now, many people join the New Age idealism because of what they think it offers them, and we'll talk about that a little more in a few, but the majority of people in power of this movement are totally 100% behind the global government movement. And they are worshippers of Lucifer. They go by the name Luciferians. For many years, there have been a number of them who are powerful yet low profile, who have been implementing policy through their power. Policy which is designed to overturn religion by force. Oh, it won't be forceful at first. At first it'll be lobbying and getting the vote. But once they attain power, then it will be by force. And they who do this, along with all the other groups and organizations, clubs and fronts that are under them, are working towards the cause of global, unchallenged rule. In other words, global government. This New Age movement is sometimes called the Age of Enlightenment movement. They're involved with occult and pagan practices found way back in ancient Europe. Many of them are outright Satanist or Wiccan, worship Wiccan, which they say is the worship of nature. They sometimes practice trancing, demonic rituals. They speak to demons through mediums, which is to say, they think they're speaking to the dead, the practice of necromancy, or they do know that they're speaking to demons. But this group has a power structure all to themselves. They are under names that seldom catch the eye of those who see them. They are students or disciples of certain theologians like Helena Blavatsky, David Spangler, Waldorf Krim, Alicia Bailey, and various other members of the so-called Illuminati underground. Incidentally, Illuminati means enlightened or shining. In the book of Genesis, Satan, when referred to as the serpent, is called the shining one in Hebrew, or the shimmering one, or even the luminous one. And these disciples of this New Age movement have written books, novels. They've opened magazines. They even opened their own publishing companies under names like the Lucifer Press. And when the Lucifer Press was exposed as to what it really was several years back, it changed its name to a less threatening, more friendly sounding establishment called the Lucius Trust Press. And since then, it has branched out, and it makes one wonder about certain technological groups like Lucid Technologies. At any rate, over the years, they have worked diligently to get their books, their ideas into the public eye under the guise of things like meditation, relaxation, yoga, holistic medicine, health food, and other guises. Again, they're never going to come out and say what they are. They hide behind helpful things. They are a consortium of people who worship Lucifer, who are hiding their true intent in seemingly innocent and helpful things. Who could ever say anything bad against relaxation and emergence techniques, which are designed to raise man's consciousness and awareness? But in fact, they have one purpose in mind: control. And they will work hand in hand with any other left-wing initiative that is against people of faith. They all stand together against the faith-based. Now, for those who think that this is just ranting about something that is harmless or just some crazy idea, I want you to consider some things. Consider where this nation has come to over the last period of years since, let's say, the year 1945. Consider the movement of where, or consider where the liberal movement has taken us. When you think about where this country was in the year 1945, and consider where it is now, do you see a lot of change from the Christian nature of things, the way it used to be, to the way it is now? Let's talk about some of those changes. First off, as the left wing came into its own, came into power, they set up buddy-buddy systems, networks. They followed a plan to take over the media, to infiltrate Hollywood, which makes the movies, and they immersed themselves into every liberal cause so that they could mince themselves into the party of liberals, into liberalism. Once they did this, they changed liberal from its former vision into what it has been becoming since they infiltrated it, a secular progressive movement. They have patterned their policies after their icons and their idols. Again, they are disciples of people like Karl Marx, Helena Blavatsky, and other various sects of New Age or communist socialistic rule. The groups that make up this are all initiatives which stand against the faith base. So it can be pagan, Satanism, Luciferic, socialism, communism, secular science, whatever you want to call it. But they are entrenched in all of these. And they entrench themselves in all of these to bring them together to be allies against the faiths-based of the world. Once they attain power, they intend to oppress religion. And they have been doing so in small ways since they achieved power. Again, the old liberals of the old Democratic Party were faith-based. And many of the liberals of the new Democratic Party claim to be faith-based. But their actions speak louder than words. Look at what they've accomplished. And look at who they point the finger of blame at. They always blame the conservative or the Christian. But was it Christians who did away with prayer in schools? No. Was it Christians who legalized the murder of the unborn through abortion? No. Is it Christians who want to take away the weapons from Americans, a right guaranteed by the Second Amendment to the Constitution of the United States? No. Is it Christians who implemented the teaching of evolution, a secular teaching, into schools and censored completely any mention of God or creation? No. Is it Christians who have drafted a bill this last year to make the teaching of the Bible, what the Bible says about homosexuality or bisexuality, a crime which is punishable by prison? No. Is it Christians who want to remove "In God We Trust" off of our currency? Or take "One Nation Under God" out of our pledge? No. Is it Christians who did away with the term, or the terms BC, meaning before Christ, and AD, meaning Anno Domini, and replaced those terms with more secular-friendly terms like BCE and CE, meaning before the Common Era and Common Era. No. Was it Christians who used lawsuits in the justice system to take away terms like Merry Christmas and replace it with Happy Holidays or Merry Xmas? Or to change school policy so that what was once called Christmas vacation is now called winter break? No. Wasn't Christians. Is it Christians who are now drafting a deceptively named bill called the Fairness in Broadcasting Act, which will effectively eliminate conservative talk radio and Christian talk shows from the airwaves? No. Well, if it isn't Christians, who is it? Well, let's think about this. What purpose does it serve to have the voice of conservative and the voice of Christians done away with? Well, then, it's not too hard to pick out exactly who is doing this. It's this conglomerate of the Sons of Cain with the people under them, the politicians, the lawyers, the millionaire businessmen who fund the websites, the big business people. They are the ones responsible. Now, I want you to consider this. If someone in the year, say, 1940 had run for office and said, I want to make abortion legal and late-term abortion legal. I want to teach kids that they are nothing more than the latest step of ape in a line of evolution, and removed any mention of God from schools. If this person said, I want to take prayer out of the schools and take one nation under God out of our pledge, and in God we trust off our money, and then said, I want to enact policy among privately owned stores to force them to call Christmas trees holiday trees under threat of lawsuit if they don't comply. I want to take away all your handguns and your rifles and all your weapons. I want you to pay higher taxes so that those who won't work can have just as good a standard of living as those who do. And I want taxpayers to pay for program after program to feed, house, and take care of their every need and counsel them. How do you think that would have gone over? Well, as you probably would have guessed, that person would have been laughed off the stage and possibly tarred and feathered or been pelted with rotten eggs and tomatoes. And the left wing has known this all along, and they still know it today. So they devised a method of changing perceptions through the use of cunning speech and through bleeding heart, do-gooderism, and perception. If they change the perception, then they can get the votes. And then they can do all of these things right under the noses of the faithful. And you know what? They have done just that. Everything that I have listed above has been accomplished by the left wing. There has long been a saying that if you put a frog into boiling water, he will jump right back out. But if you put a frog in lukewarm water and bring the heat up slowly, the frog will get used to the change and boil to death by the time he realizes it. And this is a true saying and an analogy with concern to what we were just talking about. The left has progressed, they have progressed slowly and methodically. They have taken ground from Christians and taken freedoms. They followed a very slow, methodical technique and plan. They took over the media. They took over the movies. That would just say Hollywood. And they inserted liberal jabs into television and the movies. They even selected the types of music which would become popular and prevail and be the fad. They took over the vast majority of outlets of information and news, such as magazines and newspapers. And of course, they own the news media. They always follow a plan to take over all the outlets which make perception and opinion. This is exactly the model that Hitler used. and what Hitler achieved with their funding. To gain power, Hitler first made big promises to help the poor and to put money back in the pocket of the working class. He gave unions money. He made speech after speech all over the country. And when he was reelected, he used the prevailing attitude of anti-Semitic sentiment and pandering to the poorer class to gain power, till he had enough power to where he could take over the outlets of information. He took over the radio stations. He took over the newspapers, the magazines. He created propaganda films touting patriotism for the fatherland. And he raised up a sense of pride among his nation, albeit it was misplaced. And he created industry in the buildup of his war machine. He created jobs in doing so. He built the Autobahn. And once he had attained enough power and built Germany up with a big enough military, he sprung. He sprung into action and took over by forcible rule. By then it was too late. He rounded up the Jews. He crossed into his neighbors' countries and took them by force and set up his own government. And this is the model used by globalists. They pander to get the power and then they take control by force. This is their method of manipulation. They rise to power by pandering to the poorest of society. They use their specialty tools like the war of classes and misdirected perception. The misdirected perception that they stand alone up for the voiceless. In other words, we are the only voice for the minority, the forgotten, the disenfranchised. And it gets them the votes. In America, once they took power, they made sure that programs like welfare, which were started nobly, lost its checks and balances, where they could dole it out hand over fist to anyone who needed it or wanted it, whether they deserved it or not. And this was a powerful tool for getting them votes. Imagine getting free food, free or low-income housing, free medical, free dental, free anything and everything you want, and all you have to do is vote for those who will give it to you. This reminds me of how Satan attempted to tempt Jesus Christ in the desert. Satan said to Jesus, "See all of these great cities and gold and silver? All of this will I give thee if thou wilt but fall and worship me." And modern humans, after being educated, or I should say brainwashed, from grade school, to believe that man evolved from apes, and that religion is just something to comfort people who are afraid to die, will easily bend to greed and the accepting of freebies. They will accept entitlements, especially if they have little to no faith and values, and if they are poor and feel there is no hope. So this deception works. And the left wing achieves more and more power. And as they do, we see more and more corruption, more and more lies. Yet the media doesn't call them on those lies. The media remains silent. And why? Because the media are part of them. And the media would never betray their own. You see how this works? If you can't win by speaking the truth of your agenda, which is to say we want to take your rights and communize you and thrust you into a one-world system, then you label your agenda as a fight for the poor, a fight for freedom, a fight for rights, a fight for the oppressed. And in one breath you tell Christians that they are bigots and hateful for not embracing a lifestyle which God Almighty Himself has said is perverse and shall not be done. And then in the same breath you tell them, but you're only doing it to fight for the oppressed minority group. And the uninformed, the ill-informed I should say, the easily duped, will buy it. Especially after being indoctrinated into believing that there is no God and that morality is an illusion. They have been dumbed down through left-wing policies that lowered grade point averages, so that no one is left behind or left out of graduating because that might hurt their feelings, or it might offend someone. And this is liberal, conventional wisdom, or better said, childish, immature, fleshly wisdom. When I say that, I mean how a child who knows nothing of life or how life works or responsibility might rationalize. And all of this is tied right into the 4 hidden dynasties, controlled at the top by none other than Cain's progeny. Now, many have never heard of Cain's progeny, even though they are written of in the Bible. And if you haven't, maybe you should ask yourself, why haven't I heard this? I have a 3-part lecture called The 4 Hidden Dynasties of the End Times, which outlines many of the ways they have entrenched themselves in everything from government to the educational system to the entertainment system, information, be it television, newspapers, magazines we all read, and how they have gained control of the media. They are lawyers, doctors, wealthy businessmen, politicians, teachers, professors, theologians, and they always use deception to forward their agenda. They do not wear big signs telling you what their plans are. No, rather, they speak great things. They make big promises. They pander. They pander to the poor, the so-called oppressed, the so-called minority. And they use every tool which they have always used to gain power. The war of classes, which is the rich versus the poor, the privileged versus the perceived to be disenfranchised. And this is why they gain such power, because there are always more poor than wealthy or well off, or even middle class. And many of these poor will trade their votes for the promise of being pandered to. If we look back at history, we can know this to be true. The French Revolution was a war or an overthrow of the poor versus the rich. The overthrow of Russia was the poor versus the rich. World War I, the poor versus the rich. In modern times, they call it leveling the playing field, even though it's unfair. Bitter disputes over territories and money. Hitler's whole beginning argument was that the poor didn't have enough, and the rich and the Jews had too much, while the German workers and taxpayers were overtaxed, underpaid. And this argument is still used today, only now it's American instead of German. And while everybody will agree that we are overtaxed, you have to look at those who pander and say they're going to fix everything, but constantly spend, and raise more taxes. The argument is still the exact same. The poor versus the rich. And those who seek total power are happy to use any divisive argument to cause strife between the poor and the rich, or to label anyone who isn't rich, even middle class, as rich, so they can tax them into bondage. These sons of Cain are entrenched in everything from the credit cards you buy to the insurance you pay for. Anything that keeps you in bondage. And as they have gained power in government and everywhere else, they spend, or support spending, or lobby for spending for useless feel-good programs, which cause generations of peoples to become even more dependent upon government, or big government. And this allows them to keep them poor, and to keep them as a voting base, which can always be pandered to. Now let's talk about some other things that those in real power behind this global government movement are involved in, that we had mentioned earlier, such as unions, deceptively named organizations which claim to fight for the freedoms and liberties of people, the civil liberties, but which right under the noses of the faithful and the moral are eroding law and order and tearing down justice and rights. These groups, organizations, which to the uninformed everyday people seem like good organizations, charitable organizations, green, earth-friendly, environmental organizations, cloak themselves. They practice the method that they have always used of cloaking themselves in seemingly good, reasonable things, earth-protecting things, but they use it to achieve power. Now, before I go any further, I must make it clear that not everyone involved in these groups, organizations, unions, or initiatives is part of this. Most join them for the right reasons, for legitimate causes. Their hearts are in the right places. They are simply unaware of the real purpose that these movements are being used for. In fact, most are totally oblivious to what they are inadvertently helping to bring about. And this too is a type of the big deception which is to come. Most would never suspect groups like Greenpeace, the United Way, Amnesty International, the Sahara Club, the global warming movement as being part of this, but they are. Likewise was the No Nukes movement of the 70s and all of its subsidiaries, which are now modern. The whole green, go green, feel good movement. Again, these are groups which seemingly have done good things, or have only the best intentions, or have stood for right in the face of all that is wrong. And that is exactly the image they want to portray to those they control, or to those they fool. By the same token, there are other groups involved in this ring, if you will, with patriotic sounding names, human rights sounding names, organizations and fronts with a real agenda towards globalization. Some of them are mouthpieces for the Leftwing, MoveOn.org, and all of its smaller branches, the ACLU, and other patriotic-sounding false facades, which are actually nothing more, again, but mouthpieces and bullies for the left wing. And all of them controlled by the ones at the top, the Sons of Cain. I am sure that it would surprise most if they were made aware of how many of these groups, clubs, unions, websites, and companies were controlled by the same few people under fictitious pseudonames. How can we know? How can we see that this is real and happening? Well, when we see our nation go against the will of the people on so many things, when we see our government spend mega trillions, which they don't have, when we see them print paper money, which we don't have gold or silver nor funds to cover, when we see them take away our rights and freedoms, which are guaranteed by the Constitution, and use flawed reasoning to do so, then we know that something is afoot, something bigger is coming. Let us look at where we currently are. We have a new president, which seemingly came out of nowhere, which only 4 years ago, only a few people had ever heard of his name. And his new administration, which is already involved in scandal after scandal and deception after deception and spending after spending. But regardless of this, this new administration almost daily speaks of the global agenda. In other words, the inevitable world government. Look at the current state of America. Employment at the highest level in decades. the national debt higher than it has ever been since the foundation. Yet, the president pushes through a stimulus package, so-called, which plunges the United States into super mega debt. Only they did it under the guise of helping out, of keeping us afloat. Many of the members of this current administration themselves are heavily responsible for a lot of the debt through their various programs and initiatives and schemes. They funded mortgages to people knowing full well that they could never pay them. And thanks to some of the big named Democratic senators and their cronies, the taxpayers will now have to pick up the expense for what organizations like Fannie and Freddie Mae have done. And they did all this as feel-good politics, as pandering to the poor, to the minority, giving loans where they couldn't get them. When we see this government go against anything which will make us independent, like drilling for our own natural resources, like oil and coal, and in so doing, not allowing it, keeping us in bondage to foreign oil, and whatever those who own the foreign oil want to charge us at market. And then our own government sets up policy which will tax our own businesses, our own companies, which use coal and have carbon emissions, which will put a further burden on us. When we see this happen, it defies all logic, unless you take into account what is really going on here, what they are really attempting to accomplish, which is keeping us dependent on other parts of the world for energy and fuel, and plunging the United States into such a quagmire of debt till we will be forced to remain in a union. They keep us in debt so that we have to sell off our own banks to the government and do what they call nationalizing the debt, which will increase the power of big government, which will blindly spend till they ruin our economy. So that one day we will be forced into joining the world government just to keep from falling apart. Why do you think there has been such a big move lately by companies to offer to buy up Americans' unwanted or broken gold and silver and jewelry? Because those who own these so-called refining companies know that gold and silver that many Americans possess could be traded or sold in times of trouble. And so they are buying it up now where Americans won't have it, and will be forced to obey or to not make trouble when the government achieves total power. The same with handguns. How many times do you see police agencies buy up handguns or trade for handguns under the guise of getting weapons off the streets or out of the hands of prospective criminals? Again, they are removing America's ability to defend herself. Timothy Geithner, the new Secretary of State, or the Secretary of the Treasury, only weeks ago said that this administration would not be opposed to international law being the guideline and model in America in the coming days, and that our sovereignty may have to be a thing of the past. Do you know what this means? It means other nations' laws and precedents would replace the laws currently in the United States. Well, that is to say that the laws currently in place that have not been eroded or destroyed by progressive liberal movements or the ACLU. So we can see this control building. And any movement, party, or group which rides to power on the platform of putting man's will before God's, any party which uses legalese and misinterpretation to deny the faithful from hearing the Word of God, or to evict God from our nation, whether it be prayer, pledge, or references, does not stand for righteousness or rights or freedoms, but for oppression and control, just as it was in the former Soviet Union. They may call themselves whatever they like, liberal or progressive or do-gooder, but their cause is to bring about division and confusion and unchallenged authority through deception. They are not an army of weapons, but an army which uses cunning and misleading speech to change perception and to dupe. And they work feverishly at their deception and are masters of it. They achieve power peaceably. Peace, 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 and sudden destruction. They have but one agenda in mind: power, and to rid the world of its freedoms and rights, and to rid the world of religion, and replace it with their own, which is to say, secular socialism, which is a religion. They want to rid the world of God and replace Him with the idea that man's higher thinking is the only God there is, and that they can usher in a new era. And what they are going to usher in is the great deception to come, which is to say, when Satan is cast from heaven to earth to play the role of Jesus, which is to say, the Antichrist, to deceive the world into worshiping him in place of God. And those who are in the real seat of power use the secular, the New Age, the humanist movement, the secular science movement as pawns. They use the good intentions of man against himself. Now, what do I mean? There are vast movements in this world currently. The secular humanist movement, also the New Age movement, and various other movements which are all leftist in origin. They are all against the religious. And so since they can't convince people not to be religious, then they hide themselves amongst good intentions so that people are duped to joining them and supporting them anyway. They may call themselves secular, but what they believe, what their creed is religion. It's just a religion without a deity. And they are being used by the ones in real power, the Sons of Cain. For Satan will use any tool, any means of deception he can to bring about his will, including using others who are allies against God and the faithful, whether they be communist, socialist, humanist, atheist, paganistic, secular, scientist, bleeding hearts who are apathetic to any cause, whether it be good or sickening, Luciferians, and those who just rebel. The Sons of Cain are involved in a hodgepodge, vast mix of all of these groups, like a vast army of different allies set to one common goal: deception. And though they be different names, different organizations, different groups, different unions, different powers of government, they're all tentacles of one agenda, which is the purpose of global rule and unchallenged authority deceptively enacted. And what is really sad is that many so-called Christians, which is to say representatives of God, the churches, which call themselves Christian by the name of Christ, are unaware of this plan and unaware of these sons of Cain's, or these sons of Cain. These churches, in ignorance, being unaware of what they are doing, teach religious urban myth and traditionalism as doctrine, which will lead multitudes to fall and worship Satan through ignorance of the Bible's teaching that Satan shall come and claim to be Christ returned before the return of the true Christ. And this deception works because mankind has turned his vision away from seeking God's wisdom to seeking man's wisdom. The bleeding heart and biased left-wing mentality no longer knows right from wrong. They have been dumbed down and confused themselves. So with them there is no fairness, no justice. No one is ever responsible for what they have done unless, of course, they are a hateful Christian. Then they are to blame. And this is a childish mentality. Let us not forget who controls the left. It is the same progeny of Cain, who 2,000 years ago or so denied Christ, called him a heretic, called him a liar, then set about to kill him and finally succeeded. They always choose the side of wrong. They always stand against that which is right. And they always bring about corruption and cover it with lies. They always sneak in. They have caused many of the troubles in religion, like the Spanish Inquisition, the Salem witch hunts, because they infiltrated religion and duped many into believing them and misled so many till they lost track of what the real focus of religion is. Their power is misdirection, cunning argument, designed to fool the ill-informed and unsuspecting. And when we consider all of this bias, this untruth, this unfairness, it is no wonder that people are not aware of the global agenda. In the book of Revelation, this build-up to the one world system, which is to come to power under Satan, the Antichrist, is referred to as Mystery Babylon, the mother of harlots. Mystery Babylon the Great. And this mystery doth already work to bring about a state of Babylon, which is to say confusion. And they that are amongst it are harlots, jumping into bed with any good cause, anything that sounds good. But they're all going to be deceived. As written in the book of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, for this cause God shall send them strong delusion that they shall believe a lie, that they might be damned, because they received not the love of the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. Now in part 2 of this series, we will go and read the scriptural, biblical verses showing the rise of this one world system, and how it is prophesied to come and the deception it will lead to. But I hope you will consider these things. I hope you will consider what is coming to pass right before your very eyes and under your very nose. And as long as people remain silent, they will take our rights away from us. They will force us into a one world government, which the one world government is coming whether we like it or not. It's prophesied to happen in the Bible. But this does not mean that we should stand idly by and let them communize us and tell us that we can't worship our God, that we can't believe the way we will. We should not let them use arguments like separation of church and state, which are misinterpretations of what the founders intended. Because their perverse view means that we cannot have God at all. They won't come right out and say that, but it is the truth. At any rate, please consider these things. It is my prayer for you that you will have your eyes opened, that you will study your Father's Word diligently, and that you will seek His counsel so that you will not be deceived. Thank you for listening to this talk, this commentary. This has been Just Thoughts.